Over the past few months, I've gathered a lot of new CPU data, and much of it I've continued to update with improved BIOS revisions and game updates. So with countless hours dedicated to generating as much gaming data as I can, I thought why not share all of it in a single video. It should make for an excellent guide for those of you looking at upgrading or building a new gaming PC. Today's sponsor spot is brought to you by Hetzner, a leading host provider and data center operator in Europe. By combining new technology, affordable pricing, and competent in-house support, Hetzner is a reliable and strong partner for professional infrastructure and has been since 1997. Along with their locations across the US and most recently Singapore, they also operate their own state-of-the-art centers in Germany and Finland. Hetzner servers are powerful, affordable, GDPR compliant, and are becoming more accessible for personal and business use. Alongside their Euro payment option, they're offering dollar payments for new accounts. So to learn more about what Hetzner has to offer, please check the link in the video description. Now, before we jump into the data, a few quick notes on the testing and test systems. In total, I've benchmarked 28 different CPUs across 14 games. Basically, all the relevant models are here. That said, though, there are still some CPUs missing, and that's mostly due to the fact that it's a waste of time and graph real estate to include them. For example, there's no 13th gen Intel CPUs, as they were refreshed as the 14th gen. So the 1300K and 1400K are essentially the same thing, and the same also applies to the 13600K and 14600K, and it's very much the same story with the 13700K and 14700K. Despite the 14th gen refresh receiving an additional cluster of E-cores for the i7 model, but this does little to nothing for gaming performance. I've also included the Core i3 12100, but didn't bother with the 13100 or 14100 versions as they're the same thing. You're just paying more for nothing really. For the Ryzen CPUs, I've included the Ryzen 5 7600, but excluded the 7500F as it's essentially the same CPU but without the iGPU. You also can't buy the 7500F in most regions, and this has been the case for a long time now. So if you're interested in getting a cheap 7500F from AliExpress, just look at the 7600 data as that will tell you how the 7500F performs. As usual for testing, all CPU gaming benchmarks will be conducted at 1080p using the GeForce RTX 4090. And if you'd like to learn why this is actually the best way to evaluate CPU performance for games today and in the future, I have a few videos linked in the description that you can watch to learn more. But just quickly, because this can be a subject that trips up some people who comment on these videos, I'll do my best to explain this in as little time as possible. The reason why you want to know exactly how a CPU performs in games relative to another CPU is so that you can buy the best CPU for your given price point. For example, if we were to go back to 2022 and test the 5800X 3D, 5800X and 3950X across a range of games using the fastest available GPU at the time, so the RTX 3090 Ti, we see that when using a low resolution such as 1080p for CPU limited results, the 5800X 3D is 33% faster than the 3950X, and that's despite the fact that the 3950X packs twice as many cores. But had I benchmarked at 4K using balanced upscaling, we'd see no performance difference between these processors and therefore learn nothing. Now fast forward 2 years and games are far more demanding, and as a result, the 5800X 3D is now 49% faster than the 3950X at 1080p, but more crucially, 44% faster at 4K with upscaling. So, had you paid more for the 3950X expecting it to age better than the 5800X 3D for gaming because it has twice as many cores, you would have made a very bad mistake. Anyway, I hope that helps. And just finally, I've included the test system specs on screen. All CPUs were tested in a stock configuration with optimal memory configurations using XMP or Expo. And please note the Intel Arrow Lake CPUs were tested using DDR5 8200 CU DIMM memory, which frankly is really no faster than DDR5 7200 UDIMM memory, and it just costs a lot more. But I've included CU DIMM memory as quite a few people are convinced it's much faster, so we're just going to avoid all of that noise by using it. Okay, let's get into the results. First up, we have Star Wars Jedi Survivor, and here AMD's 3D V-Cache CPUs are very dominant, with the Zen 4 and Zen 5 models crushing all other parts. Then from the more entry-level and mid-range options right up to the Core i9 1400K, performance is very similar. For example, from the Ryzen 5 7600X up to the 14900K, we're looking at just a 10% performance change, and we've tested over a dozen CPUs that fit within that range. We're really only looking at a somewhat noticeable performance drop-off with the Core i5 12400F, Ryzen 7 5700X, and then the Core i3 12100F, though all CPUs do perform quite well in this title. AMD's 3D V-Cache technology isn't as useful in The Last of Us Part 1, but even so, those CPUs do perform well, along with the new Arrow Lake CPUs. Still, this is another example where the bulk of the CPUs tested do deliver very similar performance. From the Ryzen 5 7600 up to the Core Ultra 5 245K, we're looking at a 10% increase, and then almost 20% up to the 7800X 3D. The only CPUs that might struggle to deliver a high refresh rate experience here include the 12400F and 5700X, while the Core i3 12100F will suffer noticeable performance dips. The Core i3 also takes forever to compile the pre-shaders in this title. Next up, we have Cyberpunk 2077 Phantom Liberty, and you might have noticed Intel's new Arrow Lake CPUs are performing much better in this title now. Last week, the Cyberpunk 2.2 update was rolled out and it improved Arrow Lake performance by at least 30%, and we're certainly seeing that here. The 285K is now not only faster than the 14900K, but also the 7700X, basically matching the performance of the 7900X 3D, though that does still make it 20% slower than the new 9800X 3D. Still, that's a big improvement over what we were seeing previously. Most of the CPUs tested did perform very well in Cyberpunk, and even the Core i3 12100F ensured frame times remained above 60 FPS in our test, though it was miles slower than even the 5700X. Testing with Hogwarts Legacy shows most CPUs delivering between 110 and 125 FPS, so around a 14% performance variation between parts like the 5800X 3D and 9700X, or the 7950X. Again, it's the AM5 based 3D V-Cache parts that deliver the best performance, with very noticeable gains over competing parts. Then at the opposite end, it's the 5700X and 12100F where you'll notice the drop-off. The Core i3 in particular really struggles here with 1% lows well below 60 FPS. ACC isn't a super demanding game, and core count generally doesn't matter too much here, but even so, the 12100F does drop off the pace quite a bit. This title also doesn't perform particularly well on the new Intel Arrow Lake CPUs, at least relative to competing Ryzen processors. Still, any modern entry-level to mid-range CPU will work fine. Remnant II can benefit from a high-end CPU, but it's far from a requirement, with most capable of 110 FPS. There's only a small selection of processors that fell below that figure, and just 3 were south of 100 FPS, which includes the 12400F, 5700X, and 12100F. And as we've seen numerous times already, it's the AM5 based 3D V-Cache parts that deliver the best results, unlocking that next tier of performance. Homeworld 3 is more about the 1% lows, and for whatever reason the Intel CPUs really struggle here, though so do some of the older AMD CPUs as well. The 5700X 3D is about as affordable as you'd want to go for this particular title, along with the Ryzen 5 7600. A Plague Tale Requiem plays poorly on the Arrow Lake CPUs, at least in their current condition, with the 285K allowing for just 123 FPS on average, making it slower than even the 12600K. Meanwhile, the 245K is only able to match the 12400F and 5700X. Then we have the 12100F, which is serviceable here and does quite well for a sub $100 US CPU. The 7800X 3D and 9800X 3D are of course impressive, even if you don't need over 170 FPS in this title. Practically speaking, a part such as the Ryzen 5 7600 works extremely well here. It's pretty easy to play Counter-Strike 2 at hundreds of frames per second, and I know the more serious CS2 players aim for around 300 FPS, which again is pretty easy to achieve using modern hardware. You'd probably want to avoid the Core i3 12100F, but anything beyond that seems pretty good here. Starfield is a very CPU demanding game, and achieving high refresh rate performance really isn't easy here, as it takes the 9800X 3D to average 140 FPS in our test. Moreover, parts such as the 12600K and 7600 fall just short of 100 FPS, which is still a great experience in this game, but it's also less than desirable for those of you rocking 144Hz or faster displays. The Ryzen 7 5700X does okay here with 81 FPS, but the 12100F really struggles, allowing for just 61 FPS on average with 1% lows of 50 FPS. Next we have Space Marine 2, another extremely CPU limited and CPU demanding game, as in performance is almost always limited by your CPU, and that's not because it poorly utilizes the CPU, as a game like StarCraft 2 does for example. Rather, it's because it's very CPU demanding, utilizing your CPU to its fullest. Here we see that the majority of the CPUs tested allow for between 100 and 112 FPS, with only the 7800X3D and 9800X3D pushing well past that. Then, at the opposite end of the graph, we see the Core i3 12100F really struggling in this title, as 1% lows fall well short of 60 FPS. The Ryzen 7 5700X hangs in there reasonably well, as does the 12400F. Yet another CPU demanding game is Star Wars Outlaws, though our particular test scene has a 142 FPS cap, and I'm not exactly sure why that is, as we do see much higher frame rates in other sections of the game. Anyway, 142 FPS is certainly sufficient, so a number of high-end CPUs do very well here. Sadly, however, the old and affordable Core i3 is showing its age in this one, allowing for just 56 FPS on average with 1% lows of just 38 FPS. Even the 5700X struggles in this example, so ideally you will want at least a Core i5 12400F. Hitman 3 is an older game, so naturally it runs just fine on older or lower end CPUs such as the Core i3 12100F and Ryzen 7 5700X. In fact, outside of those two parts, all other CPUs were able to throughput over 200 FPS, and we are looking at a 42% performance increase from the 5700X3D up to the 9800X3D. Another old game included for testing is Watch Dogs Legion, and really the only CPU to struggle here was the Core i3 12100F, though with 93 FPS on average and 1% lows of 67 FPS, performance was perfectly acceptable, especially for an ultra-affordable entry-level CPU. Then from the 5700X on, it's smooth sailing, and any additional performance is a nice luxury at that point. Okay, so here's all the data from the 14 games tested, calculated using the GeoMean. With the improvements made in Cyberpunk, the 285K is now just 4% slower than the 14900K, which obviously still isn't great, but progress is being made here. Still, it's unlikely Intel will be able to challenge AMD at the high end for at least the next few years, but towards the middle of the pack there are potential for some decent value options, but really where Intel is doing its best work right now is at the entry level with aging discounted parts such as the Core i5 12400F, which is probably the most popular Intel CPU released in the last 5 years or so. The Core i3 12100F though is starting to run into trouble and I feel is no longer worth investing in. Spending a little more on the 5700X or 12400F would be the way to go, so let's take a look at the cost per frame data. As I noted earlier, I wasn't able to test every single possible CPU configuration you can purchase right now, because frankly that's nearly impossible, but we do have the vast majority of relevant data. The Ryzen 5 5600 for example, that would have been a nice inclusion, but at $110 US it costs the same amount as the 12400F, and it will be a bit slower given the 5700X is 3% slower. In my opinion, for those of you building a brand new PC, neither the LGA 1700 nor the AM4 platform makes sense, unless you're looking at spending as little as possible. But even then, a strong argument could be made that stepping up to a modern platform like AM5 is a better value choice, especially in the long run. But if that isn't an option, I think building a 12400F system is a decent choice. It's certainly one of the cheapest options out there, especially given that the 5700X3D was just 15% faster on average. Admittedly, that's a big gain, but at almost twice the price, it's hard to justify that additional investment. Because at that point, you might as well just buy the Ryzen 5 7600, which also costs $200 US and is slightly better in terms of cost per frame. So, you're unlikely to buy into the AM4 platform now with a $110 US Ryzen 5 7600 and then later upgrade to an X3D chip. That seems like a very bad way of going about things in late 2024. Even when it comes to the Core i5-12400F, I think it makes sense for those of you on a budget who are performing a platform upgrade, but for new system builders, it's probably worth stepping up to the Ryzen 5 7600 as the overall investment won't be that much more. Anyway, whereas previously I was recommending the 12100F for entry-level gaming, I'm going to upgrade that pick to the 12400F, but could just as easily go with AM4, but you'd have to stick with the slower 5600 for it to make sense, because if you were to go with a more expensive, higher-end AM4 processor, you might as well just jump to AM5 with the 7600. Speaking of which, the Ryzen 5 7600 is the budget king right now, and for those upgrading, once you factor in the rest of the platform cost, such as the motherboard and memory, it's not that much more than the 12400F. And therefore, I feel for new system builders, you could ignore the 12400F. Sadly though for gamers, Intel's new Core Ultra series is very poor in terms of value, the cheapest of which being the 245K, which is worse value than the 9700X, which is much worse value than the 7700X and 7700. So for mid-range performance, those Ryzen 7 processors make more sense, and then once you get to the high end, it's hard to look at anything other than the 9800X 3D, and that's probably why it's difficult to find them in stock. So that's what each CPU has to offer in terms of value and performance, and of course we are just looking at the cost of the CPU in our value analysis. The cost of stuff like motherboards and memory can vary, depending on what you're after. The Ryzen 5 7600 versus Core i5-12400 is a pretty tough one. It's not clear which one of these CPUs budget buyers should get. And I also haven't forgotten about the 7500F, but it kind of seems like maybe AMD has, as you can really only get them over on AliExpress. That said, if you are willing to buy from AliExpress, I recommend you do so, as you can land the Ryzen 5 7500F for as little as $128 US with free shipping, which is insane. So really, that's my recommendation. Buy the 7500F from China because it's dirt cheap and hands down the best value option right now. But if for whatever reason that isn't an option, you have the choice between the $110 12400F and $200 7600. For those of you carrying out a platform upgrade, the Core i5-12400F will cost you $110 US for the CPU, about $90 for a decent DDR4 motherboard, or $120 for a DDR5 board, which will allow for the performance shown in this video. And then you'll either need $50 for DDR4 3600 32GB memory, or $90 for DDR5 6400 memory in a 32GB kit. And that means the DDR4 package will cost you around $250, and then about $320 for the DDR5 version. So an almost 30% premium for what will be around 10% better performance on average, making DDR4 the better value choice. Then we have the Ryzen 5 7600 for $200. A decent AM5 motherboard will cost you around $110, and then about $100 for a good quality, low latency DDR5 6000 CL30 32GB memory kit. So $410 US all up. When compared to the DDR4 12400 option, that's a little over a 60% premium for what will work out to be almost 30% better performance, making the DDR4 12400F configuration the more cost-effective upgrade package. But with the DDR4 version for the Core i5, you are getting much slower memory, which is increasingly becoming a performance-limiting factor with newer games, and there's virtually no upgrade path, as LGA 1700 processors are still quite expensive, especially the Core i7 and i9 models that will be worth upgrading to, or would be if the price was a little more enticing. Still, if the aim is to upgrade while spending as little as possible, the 12400F is pretty hard to go by, if not impossible to beat, unless you head over to AliExpress. Though even then I should note that you can also purchase the 12400F for as little as $80 on AliExpress, so I guess it still wins. But what about for those of you building an entire PC? If we add in the cost of a graphics card, let's say you're able to get an ARC B580 for $250, a 2TB SSD for $90, a good case for about $80, a power supply for $60, and we're just going to go and use the box cooler, that adds an additional $480 US to our budget. That means the DDR4 12400F build now costs $730 and the 7600 build $890. So about a 20% premium for a system that will be at least 20% faster. And that's when pairing the 12400F with DDR5 memory, so it'll be faster again. That means for those of you upgrading who want to spend as little as possible while still getting a capable system, the Core i5 12400F is hard to beat. But if you're starting from scratch, as in building an entirely new gaming PC, while remaining budget conscious, the Ryzen 5 7600 is going to be a better, wiser investment in my opinion. Beyond those parts, the Ryzen 7 7700 represents great value, though it is only a very small upgrade over the 7600, and then we have the new 9700X, which it's a capable part, but it's still far too expensive. The next step up would be the Ryzen 7 7800X 3D, or the new 9800X 3D, and since you can't really get the 7800X 3D, you'll have to try and get your hands on the 9800X 3D. For most though, the 7600 and 7700 will suffice, but if you want the very best gaming performance, or you happen to play competitive shooters for example, the 9800X 3D will take things to the next level. Other CPUs that I haven't touched on include the cheapest AM5 processor, the 8500G, but at $150 US, it doesn't really make sense. This model is slower than a 12400F, so it's not really worth considering. And this really goes for most of AMD's APUs when pairing them with a discrete GPU. Anyway, that is going to do it for this look at the current CPU market. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video and found it useful. I know I didn't discuss all of the CPUs here, but all the data is there so you can take a look at them and work out what's going to offer you a viable upgrade or which one makes sense for you. So anyway, if that is the case, give it a thumbs up, subscribe for more content. I will do like a top 5 best CPU content piece in the coming weeks, so that might help narrow it down a bit more easily for those of you that were overwhelmed by all the graphs. But anyway, we have the join button if you want to become a member. Patreon is another way of becoming a Hardware Unboxed member to get access to our Discord server, monthly live streams, behind the scenes content, and Q&A stuff. So check that out if you're interested, but if not, that is perfectly fine. And I would like to thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve. See you again next time.